Good morning and welcome to Blain's Morning Porridge. It's February 19th, 2026. Tariffs hoist Trump on his own petard. Let's start off with a quote. And I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for these pesky kids. Sometimes you just have to laugh. Tariffs have been the cornerstone of Trump's economic miracle, allowing him to deflect, discombobulate, and distract voters from economic truths. Now the New York Fed says tariffs are a consumption tax, and even MAGA voters will be worried as the midterms approach. Now I reckon that a fair number of Porridge readers and now watchers will remember Scooby-Do. Donald Trump is the evil financial economic genius planning the ultimate political heist. His cunning plan to ensure a MAGA landslide in the midterms, which are just 8 months away, was utterly brilliant. Slap tariffs on everything and keep telling the American people the economy was booming because of them. Keep telling them till they believed it. The bigger the lie, the better it sounds. Brag about big foreign investments, boast about new factories, as yet unbuilt. I particularly admired the brazen promise to increase US defense spending by around 50% to $1.5 trillion on the back of the unlimited bounty off tariff income. Then wait, and in March, just as the political campaign season kicks into high gear, Trump was going to tell the people that tariffs had been so successful and so bigly restored global respect for the USA that he's able to cancel them. And by removing what is a massive consumption tax on the US economy, he will generate a deflationary spike and an economic boom that will peak just around Election Day in November. And foreign leaders will queue up to praise his munificence. As I said, it's genius of the highest order, if it wasn't for those pesky kids at the New York Fed. Last week, of course, the New York Fed released a report showing clearly that US firms and consumers have borne almost all of the costs of tariffs. Foreign exporters into the US have paid just over 10% of the total tariffs. The rest has been absorbed by US producers and paid by consumers in higher prices. Tariffs are a consumption tax in America. Simple as. Who knew? US readers or listeners, that's a sarcasm alert. The economic picture may get even worse. It now sounds like the Fed is getting nervous on inflation and the overheating economy. It may roll back on easing rates, even as overseas governments, notably Singapore this morning, warning of deteriorating trade conditions as the world starts to tire of the non-stop Washington shit show. And now it just gets plain funny. The man who would have been chairman of the Federal Reserve, Trump's economic whisperer-in-chief, Kevin Hassett, is furiously demanding the authors of the New York Fed report are disciplined for their embarrassing report, calling it the worst report he's ever seen. Well, of course it is. While few neutral economic think tanks or recognized financial institutions have come out in favor of Trump's tariffs, the list of respected names that say they impose costs on households and businesses is substantial. The Congressional Budget Office, the US Tax Foundation, and even Yale's Budget Lab all back up the findings of the New York Fed, concluding that tariffs are a consumption tax, will impact GDP, will raise overall taxation without increasing revenues, and that's because the rich pay less when taxation is regressive, and foreign economies suffer less. Of course, everything in the Trump administration is smoke and mirrors, and Hassett is a very disappointed man. He didn't get the Fed job because he carried too much baggage. He would have failed to win the Senate confirmation process because he was so clearly Trump's political shill being put into the job to deliver Trump's demands for lower rates. He's not a central banker. but an academic. Had he been nominated by Trump, the relief rally that accompanied Kevin Warsh's nomination 2 weeks ago would likely have been a bond market crash, as the market figured it would have meant the end of Fed independence. And now Hassett is howling into the wind that the Fed is undermining the administration. He claims that foreign firms are impacted by tariffs because they reduce their margins to export into the USA. But that doesn't make sense because it wouldn't result in a single dollar of income coming into the USA if they're cutting profits in their home nations. He claims that tariffs are mitigated by the strong dollar, which has fallen in value 7% since Liberation Day last April, meaning the costs are even higher on the USA of tariffs. And he sees tariffs creating long-term dynamic supply chains and manufacturing shifts in favor of the US. But if these happen, they won't happen for years well down the line in return for creating short-term damage now. And who knows what future US governments may do to unravel and reverse the Trump era. Had you asked me 10 years ago if we'd ever see a US administration, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve screaming liar, liar, pants on fire at each other, it would have seemed impossible. But today we just shrug it off because that is the new normal under Trump. The New York Fed just needs to keep telling the truth as they see it. This administration is undermining itself in that particularly MAGA way of shouting it loudly, louder, and louder still to convince the 40% of Americans who vote for him to still believe and keep believing. Now, Trump and his backing choir of Whiskey Greer, Lutnick, and Besant have argued repetitively that tariffs bring in money. Well, yes, they do. American consumers and producers give them the money. They also claim that tariffs generate Fed revenue. Well, yes and no. Tariffs are a regressive tax that barely impacts the rich, but hit the poorest in society hardest, and they are the most likely to be MAGA voters. And when tariff revenues are used to allow tax cuts, as they were with the big beautiful bill, that means that the wealthy end up paying less because they get the biggest tax cuts, therefore revenues actually fall. They also argue that tariffs will restore American manufacturing by protecting businesses from unfair competition, and that's a no again. It's a consumption tax American firms are paying, therefore making them less competitive. They argue that it will attract foreign firms to build capacity in the USA. No, ultimately it will be cheaper for foreign firms not to produce in the USA when tariffs make production costs higher. Tariffs are also used as an expression and a lever of power. Well, they were. At first they seemed shocking, and countries were desperate to avoid them. But now foreign powers increasingly realize it's the US that pays. They are more concerned now with global slowdown and geopolitical instability, and from that stems the current mistrust of America. Now, a whole bunch of Republican but MAGA thumbnailed US senators and congressmen are facing elections. They have come out in favor of Trump and tariffs in the past, and it's going to be really interesting to hear through this campaign season how they defend the tariff regime in coming months to angry voters who feel misinformed and their pockets are emptier. Now, in any really good Scooby-Doo mystery, there should be some unfinished business to be revealed around about the same time that the villain, usually the haunted school janitor, is hauled off to jail. In this case, it's inflation. Why haven't tariffs generated the kind of inflation that economists all expected? Well, that's complex, and it's largely due to tariffs being fairly concentrated in specific goods and sectors rather than across all the goods and services of the US economy, and by them being one-off rather than sustained price hikes. And let's be honest, the tariff rates have been up and down so much as Trump has tackled each time he faces a threat, so we haven't seen a single impact that you could point to saying that's tariffs. Now, what is the real risk of an inflation shock on the back of tariffs? If the global economy slows because of exhaustion with the whole process, well, that could trigger inflation. And it's clear that the battle for the Fed's independence is not yet won or anywhere close to over. But Trump's credibility will be tested at the midterms, and even the core MAGA base is not immune to the increasing noise and the whiff of corruption around things like Epstein, or even the recent crypto party pushing all things Liberty World at Mar-a-Lago by Trump's sons last week. If there were to be a geopolitical or energy shock, as may follow if we have conflict with Iran, who knows what could happen, and that could be the trigger for inflation. Anyway, that's enough for this morning. I'm out of time. I got to run off and do the day job. You can find the Morning Porridge on www.morningporridge.com, and if you sign up, you get it delivered fresh to your inbox every morning. I'll be back with something completely different tomorrow. And remember, Fridays are rant day. Thanks very much for your attention. Bye.